Welcome back to another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the nonprofit accounting podcast. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler. With me, as always, is Mark Palardy.
Hey, everyone.
Got a great episode. Our first article for the week is why donor privacy is important. Should donor information on major donor information on your 990 be kept private? The Supreme Court seemed to think so. Maybe their reasoning was a bit off base. We'll talk about pros and cons, unlike the article, but we'll talk about the pros and cons of donor privacy, why it's important, why maybe it should be revealed. We'll talk about that. Then our heady article for the week is Public Interest in Technology, A Bridge to the Future. The article is written basically on how you can make technology deployment equitable for everybody and make sure that it's reaching even the people in the general public that need that technology, and how you take that into account when you're building new technology. We'll redirect it on what it means for a nonprofit, how we took the article, maybe some of our criticisms of the article itself, but we'll get into that. And then last article for the week is what is the nonprofit sector of a future equitable world? We'll talk about activism in the nonprofit space, how this author frames that in social justice terms, and and what we think about how the author framed it. And then our topic of the week is admin expenses don't match up with an offered salary. This question that came to us is somebody that is looking for a job and they know the salary that's offered for that job. And when they looked at the 990 or the annual report, their admin expenses was less than the salary offered. And they're wondering how that is. Well, we'll get into allocations and all that, and you get ready. We're going to give you a little nonprofit accounting kind of 101 on admin expenses. But Mark, you have our first article. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. Yeah, this first article is from our friends over at the Philanthropy Daily, and it's called Why Donor Privacy is Important by Jonathan Hanna. And this is an interesting article about a recent Supreme Court case, about where the Supreme Court case, there was the state of California had ruled that on the 990 that they wanted to start requiring Schedule Bs from the nonprofits in the state of California. Now, a Schedule B is, for those of you lay people who don't do 990s every day, the Schedule B is that schedule that has you give donor information for anybody who's giving more than $5,000 in a fiscal tax year to the organization. So the IRS requires that you fill this out so that they know who your high value donors are, but most states do not. And the state of California said, well, we want to start collecting these Schedule Bs, and we want to require this so that we know for our purposes, whatever those purposes are, who those people are. We're not going to release that information, of course, but we just want information known as to who the high value donors are. And the Supreme Court ruled that the state of California, their law requiring nonprofit organizations to disclose that identity of those donors was invalid due to the free speech clause of the amendment. So that's basically, this article goes into why the author thinks that this is a good idea. He would go further as to say it has more to do with the free speech clause of they ruled it on the free speech clause, but he wants to add in the right to assemble and speak freely in that, because basically a nonprofit, in his estimation, is an assembly of people, and therefore you shouldn't be tracked as to who you're assembling with. He gives a few reasons why donors expect privacy, including many religious traditions encourage us to give anonymously, being modest, the preference to avoid unwanted fundraising solicitations, and the ability to stay free from harassment from people who give to particular charities. That fourth piece is probably the most contentious. We've talked in the past about different kind of charities, and I have some counterpoints to this article, but I'm going to let AJ comment on this at the jump.
Yeah, I thought overall, when I first read the article, I thought, or when I saw the headline, I'm like, well, I'm always for more transparency. But after reading the article, I thought he and the court made some good points where, like the Schedule B, not only does it list the donor's name and how much they provided, but it's also supposed to list their address. Now, I mean, that can be, troublesome in a few ways. You're essentially have the ability to dox, and they met somebody that's donated, openly to an organization, or maybe even anonymously to an organization, and it comes out that they're a major donor for something. I do feel differently if we're talking, this lumps all nonprofits into one bucket. And in that bucket, I think, political action groups, super PACs, or, any of these other nonprofits that have a political leaning or some kind of cause to it that relates in the political sphere. I think I would argue that, it's kind of a necessity to know who's donating to what, to understand who's funding political action, or who's, and who's funding, not true grassroots efforts. There's a distinction in how you disclose that stuff, how you disclose lobbying. If it's true lobbying versus like a grassroots effort versus, like how a super PAC operates. So I think, there's some nuance there, and lumping all nonprofits into one bucket maybe is not the best thing. But I do agree that, this could harm nonprofits if, Schedule Bs, if the ruling was different. I don't believe that they'll come back in the, I don't see this as being an easily overturned. California made a move to try and make this a thing in California, and much like most laws, how New York and California goes, how the rest of the nation eventually goes, as far as laws go. So it was like kind of a dip your toe in to see if this will work, through the California state law to see if they could actually make this happen. But overall, I agree with the ruling. I think my only issue is again, I think it reinforces the corporations and money and free speech all being lumped in together, how money equals free speech, and you giving with your wallet is the same as you opening your mouth and saying saying what you would like, and having the freedom to say anything you would like, and dissent in either side, I think is a cornerstone of America. But lumping it as corporations and money equals free speech, I just don't agree with it. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. And I usually don't like to lay out my political leanings on the podcast, but it's just the way I feel. I think he does make some good points about, the fact that, remaining anonymous and being able to give to the nonprofits that you feel deserve your money, and not fear some kind of backlash on that side. Or that you could be exposed. Now, the chances of normal everyday people being outed on a Schedule B are small, because there's it's not just the 5,000. If you have a lot of revenue, you have to there's some percentage, and I think it's like 3% or 3.5%. I'd have to go back and look. Of a threshold of total revenue, that if somebody made a grant or a donation above that threshold, then you report them. It's 5,000 or this percentage, and you get to pick whichever is more advantageous for less disclosure. And so if you're a large organization and you have hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue coming in every year, it's very likely that only the top 0.1% of your donors or funders are going to be listed there. And that includes private foundations, grantors, and private individuals that are listed on that Schedule B. So I don't necessarily know, if it was made widely available, that it would affect everybody like they think it is. This article makes it seem like it would just list everybody that gave $5 to the organization would be listed. But what it does do is it would release large donors and really, out somebody that maybe doesn't want their political leaning or their support for a certain organization thrust into the media or into the public sphere, and could cause less donations for an organization. So, I mean, that's where I lie on it. I don't think it's going to change, and I don't think me, rabble rousing about it is going to do anything. But I do think Schedule B is there for a reason. And it's to hold accountable where large donations are coming from in a nonprofit. No longer can you just remain anonymous. It's there for review. And the reason why it's listed is if there's some kind of improper funding or money laundering or something like that, that your largest donors can be reviewed at some time by a tax authority or a legal authority if subpoenaed. So I think it makes sense the way it's set up now. I don't necessarily know anything's going to change about it, but Mark, I'm sure you have an opinion on this after reading it.
Me have an opinion? Gee, AJ, that's an understatement. Anyway, I have a couple fundamental problems. One problem is with this article, and that's, I'm not really fond when somebody who has an agenda sets up a straw man argument but never presents the other side. So throughout this whole article, he talks about why privacy is good and why this law was bad, and he makes a case for it, but he never speaks about what the other side thought or how the other side argued. And as a critical thinker out there, I would just encourage my entire podcast audience, vast as you are, to actually look when you're read something critically and think about, well, what did the other side argue here? I don't care. Even if you read it and it aligns with your political beliefs, it's always a good idea to kind of get the lay of the land and figure out what the other side is saying. So in my interest, I went ahead and did that because the ruling came down to the Supreme Court with the 6 conservative justices voting for and 3 liberal justices voting against along party lines. And the author of this article basically waves a flag and says, well, look, the ACLU and the NAACP, clearly liberal organizations, were in favor of these privacy rulings as well, but doesn't ever lay out as to what the other side said. So what I found was that Justice Breyer, who wrote the dissenting opinion in this, talked and questioned largely what AJ was bringing up here, was that this is the slippery slope towards political speech, right? Because once you start opening the door for these privacy rulings all over the place, then all of a sudden money, as AJ also said, is free speech, and giving to political organizations, whether they be nonprofits and eventually for-profits, becomes more and more anonymized, and you start having people with large, huge war chests who are funding their own personal agendas without any sunshine from the government in any way. That hasn't happened yet, but the California law is really there to spread some sunshine and to kind of illuminate on a state level who's giving money to specific organizations. And we're not talking $5 donations. We're talking anybody giving northwards of $5,000. So that's somebody who's got a significant interest in a specific organization or a specific agenda. So in the case of a nonprofit, it's obviously a cause you believe in if you're going to give that kind of money. So are you giving a lot of money to a lot of different organizations and you're trying to move the needle? That's not illegal, right? But at the same time, the California law and the way that the liberal justices kind of framed it is they're wanting to remove dark money from the equation. Dark money is that money that just kind of floats around and could be ill-gotten gains, could just be people trying to have outsized influence. And so they want more education and more transparency. And that's why there was dissenting opinion, because they didn't feel what California was doing was necessarily wrong. And I find the argument that this author makes that, religions teach us to be modest. It's like, come on, right? Like this modesty argument, or, religious traditions want you to give anonymously. I don't know that this is written in the tenets of any historic or religious texts, and it could be. I could, prove me wrong. You can't. No, I'm just kidding. So I just have a problem when somebody doesn't present the other side of an argument. And while now I'll spill the beans and say, I actually don't think privacy is a bad thing. And I think, it might have been an overreach from California, but I want to argue, I want to see both sides of an argument before I reach that conclusion and not just be led down the rosy path. Oh, of course, this guy is right. Look at the great arguments he makes. So that's my only point, because here on the podcast, we try to give you both sides of the argument, and we're gonna look at some liberal leaning articles here in a little bit that I'm gonna have similar problems with on the other side. So, AJ, I think you got our second article for us. Why don't you take it away?
Well, and I'll piggyback off what you said about the article we just finished here about the privacy. Is the article itself was maybe 5 or 6 paragraphs of text. He could have spent another 20 minutes and wrote another 2 or 3 paragraphs on the other side of the argument, and maybe present his argument to why those are not valid points. But yeah, I would say just
completely agree. Yeah.
Maybe spend a little bit more time than 20 minutes banging out a quick article to make deadline, So that's all I'm saying. If I would have put it together, I would have gave a few more paragraphs on the other side. Our next article is from I always have a problem saying that. Stanford Social Innovation Review, SSIR, which is not your feed that comes to your phone. It's actually the Stanford Social Innovation Review. The title of the article is Public Interest Technology Bridge to the Future. So two leaders, and surprise, surprise, they mentioned their organizations in the article. We'll have it linked in the description if you would like to read it for yourself. But 2 leaders from business and philanthropy share recommendations for building stronger internal teams and a cross-sector ecosystem focused on designing technology with the needs of the public in mind. So the heart of the article is really them talking a long time about how their organizations reach across the bridge and the divide and take into consideration when they're building technologies or granting for technologies. One of them's from Cisco Systems, which is a computer and technology company, and the other one is the Ford Foundation, a large foundation that grants hundreds of millions of dollars every year in the form of grants to other nonprofits or other foundations and nonprofits. And essentially what they're doing is the article, and this is a rare thing, usually when we read one of these SSIR articles, they're very like deep, well researched, well put together on how they're framing their argument, and then they're really a deep read. This one kind of rubs me as more of like good pats on the back and very generalist. Although it is referenced, it's a well-written article, and I think they do a pretty decent job of explaining what they're talking about. But all of that is to say, I think what's presented in the article is much more window dressing than it is actual like nitty gritty of how you do this. What I did take away from the article, and what I'd like to focus my discussion on, at least, and Mark, you can take this in a different way if you want, but it really laid out good points on how when they're talking about the delivery of technology or the development of technology, for instance, they're talking about how you need to take everybody into account and how low income or marginalized groups are able to access that technology if they have the access to the technology, and making sure that when you're developing these things that it's open for everybody, and using privacy data and data collection in a responsible way is what they were saying. And so I agree with those, and I think that that's a good point to make. They don't necessarily get into the nitty gritty of how they do that, which I think would have been a much more viable piece on how they do that in their organizations, and laying out what you can do in your organization to make that happen. They talk in very general terms in the article. The Ford Foundation was talking about how when they're giving grants and funds to other nonprofits, how they evaluate and take into consideration, and how they've built an ecosystem for including those marginalized groups that need that money and funding more. And what they don't mention is that essentially what they've done is they've stuck a bunch of buzzwords in their grant applications. This is me speaking. This isn't in the article. I feel like they put a bunch of buzzwords in their grant applications, and then they fund those programs based on those. I have a pretty cynical view, I think, of how this large foundation looks at these grants. So I could be wrong, but that's the feeling that I got in reading the article. So I know my feelings aren't facts, but it's just really the tone that they took with the article of a lot of back pats and kind of like that. What I took away from the article, though, that I think was positive is how they talked about silos and about like when you're making technology or you're granting and like removing silos in a business. And I'm a strong proponent of that. And I think what nonprofits can take away from that, anybody that's listening to the podcast can take away from that. When I think of a nonprofit and you're developing like a program or funding or delivery of service or anything that a nonprofit does, including, how the nonprofit operates, it's super important to have that, not silo those things. An HR department should not just be involved with HR. They should be involved with the development department to make sure that people are being involved that need to be involved, and that like how programs are being developed, make sure that everybody in the organization is brought in. And that should carry over, like the accounting department should be involved with the development department so they can understand like donations and bequests and endowments coming in and the accounting treatment behind that. They also need to be involved with the program managers themselves, and it's a two-way street. The accountant needs to be able to tell that program person how they can spend their money, what they can't spend their money on, where are they at in their budget, how close are they to meeting their goals for the year, and then giving them the financial information to be able to report on their programs when they're doing narrative returns or narrative driven reports back to funders, to be able to bolster that with some kind of financial information if needed. And then like the executive branch or the administrative branch of being able to, kind of look at the nonprofit as a whole and make sure that people aren't siloed in their respective departments, head down, just looking at one thing. So that's what I took away as a positive from the article. Of course, there was more negative that, like I had more negative connotations when I was reading the article. But Mark, I'd love to get your take on this article. I've rambled on enough here.
I think you're being very generous, AJ, with your inserting stuff into the article that I didn't even read that deep into, but that comes with our knowledge of the nonprofit sector and why we're here. I think this is going to be another example for me to kind of point to critical thinking, right? And look and see who your authors are, and A, if they have an axe to grind, or B, if they have something that they're promoting. And in this case, the article was written by two gentlemen that one works for Cisco and one works for Ford, and they got together and they wrote a pretty glowing piece patting themselves on the back. I think there are some interesting pieces in here. I will just serve to remind everybody that I always do when the Ford Foundation comes up. Henry Ford is a troubled individual, and you can look at historically who he was and what he believed in, and that some of his ideas were very anti-Semitic and were created at a time where he did some not nice things. He did some great things for industry, but I think the Ford Foundation now exists to kind of try to whitewash and forget some of that historical context. So to read an article where the Ford Foundation is extolling the virtues of diversity, it feels a little icky to me. Like, really? Like, this would come from a better audience to me. This would come from a nonprofit where there are, where there's diversity as part of your mission, and maybe people of color writing this article. But regardless, I do think there are some bits in here that are interesting. Just structurally, one of the things I'll just pull out from near the end is the idea of hiring public interest technologists. So that's kind of, like AJ was mentioning, buzzwordy, right? But I think if we break that down, if we start hiring people in IT and hiring people who are doing technology that have the public interest at stake, it appeals to me because it actually takes into account some of these larger picture movement forward of how we can start looking at IT, looking at technology, and not just have it be a department that, what are your technological needs for your specific department, for your siloed environment? We'll take care of those technological needs, and we won't think about how this impacts the rest of the organization or society at large. So I would like to see a trend in nonprofits moving towards this public interest technologists, and see as we grow and we kind of morph, more of that, because that kind of takes society at large. I don't know that we're heading in that direction. This might just be aspirational, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Mark. I think, making sure, and this is what I'll end my kind of rant on, is making sure that when you're a nonprofit, and I have to imagine, the Ford Foundations of the world aren't listening to this podcast. Well, I hope not, after we kind of trashed them a little bit, but whatever. But I think you're right. I think, like the nonprofits that probably listen to this podcast or engage in this podcast need to think about this and how they delivered their services, and how it can reach as many people that need those services as possible. And sometimes technology isn't the answer. Sometimes, we talk about really disenfranchised, income inequality groups, or, so economically challenged groups. They may not have easy access to the internet. I know that sounds weird in 2022, like you got the internet on your phone at drop of a dime. You're carrying a computer in your pocket, but some people can't afford phones even. So, and trying to research or access things through a phone, may be easier for somebody, or maybe that's the technology route you take. But really, thinking about how you can reach the most people, and sometimes maybe technology isn't the best answer. Maybe more of like, boots on the ground, paper and pencil, going out to those communities that need it the most to make sure that they're accessing the services they need, I think is something to think about when you're creating these, and really thinking about the end user, whether that's the programs or the people that are in your nonprofit, and really taking all of that into account when you're creating programs and you're delivering them, I think is vital. And I think that's what I took away from the article. So, Mark, you got our next article for us?
You bet, AJ. This one is called "What is the Nonprofit Sector of a Future Equitable World?" And this one comes to us from Aine Creedon at Nonprofit Quarterly. So the crux of this article is basically laying out the case that income equality has grown over the years, and we've also seen a rise in the nonprofit sector alongside that rising inequality. Basically for the past 3 decades, there's been an explosion in the nonprofit sectors, both sides, and the diversity. So some of these statistics I found interesting. The number of Americans employed by nonprofits nearly doubled to 9.7 million, and 10% of the American workforce is now in the nonprofit sector. That seems like a high number to me, but if that's true, that piece I'd like to explore more. I think, basically as we wend our way through this article, the author is making the case that the rise of inequality she's tying it to the rise in the nonprofit sector, which I think is a little bit of a leap. I think correlation is not necessarily causation. So, I'm going to kind of fall back on another one of my old philosophy major tropes, like, I had a little bit of trouble with this one, simply because it really is trying to link the idea of inequality to the idea of the rise of the nonprofit sector. And I wasn't quite convinced. But at the end, she then kind of falls back on the other side, saying that because nonprofits exist, it gives a place for areas of social justice and a more just society to come about, and that American society would be radically different if not for the vitality of our nonprofit sector. So I think this is kind of a case of the author wanting their cake and eat it too. But I think it is interesting, discussion-wise, to look at the idea that with the growing, is there a connection between the growing place of, growing inequality and the rise of the nonprofit sector? Or is the nonprofit sector an outgrowth of necessity because inequality keeps happening? So we find more and more people at the lower end of the scale who need nonprofit services. That could be as well. So that's kind of how they laid it out. AJ, I'll let you jump in here.
Boy, this article really, it's a lot of word salad, or, I guess when I read an article and I want to think critically about something, this one was very much just, yeah, it was a lot of fluff, to be honest. I didn't get a lot of substance from it, and I kind of, there was no, when they use these buzzwords like, social justice, philanthropy, and, like a future of an equitable world, it, I don't see a path. Like, they're not providing a plan on how this is happening. One of the things they do say, one of the things the author of the article said is, salaried jobs allow activists to dedicate their lives to a cause without needing a quote unquote day job. And as the sector has grown, a number of professional activists have increased dramatically, adding to the sheer number of hours dedicated to social justice endeavors. I don't necessarily know, you know what I mean? I guess when they mean activists and they're talking about a day job and they're talking about dedicating their lives to a cause, it really gives me pause. Like, it seems very extreme, I guess, or takes an extreme view of hiring, like activists. And I'm not talking about left or right here. I'm talking about, anybody that would be far left, far right, and how, you just give them a salary to let them, do their activist stuff. I think if you really want to make a change and you really want to present, and work for an organization that's really helping people, activism is one thing, but really boots on the ground and doing something about it and making, a monetary change in somebody's life, or, directing somebody towards education to better themselves, to bring them out of where they are, to, implement programs so that underserved communities or people of color are thrust up and able to, come out of that cycle, would be much, I would be much more, looking for something that would show a path of how somebody that is quote unquote an activist and just going and just doing activism about something, or making the world aware of a problem, could be directed into something that has tangible outcomes to it, and I think that's what I'd like to see in the article kind of present better, instead of just kind of musing about, how, this has to happen, and they're kind of like paper thin ideas on what needs to be done. And so I just think, just thrusting more people into this and giving them a salary to do what they already do is it's gonna sink a nonprofit. I mean, they have to have some kind of program that these salaried individuals are working towards, and boots on the ground work that needs to be done, so that you can reverse the trends that you're railing against, and I think not having just this word salad of just throwing stuff out there, it doesn't do much to paint a picture of how that's done, I guess. And it's a lot of big words to say a bunch of nothing. I mean, really is how I saw the article, to be completely honest.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point with the activism, AJ, because I think it's like, so you want to be an activist, right? And so here's how you get to be an activist in life and make a decent salary. You go and you find an organization and you fight, and you pull in your money. And I think that's putting the cart before the horse, right? Where it's like, if there's something you're passionate about and you're fighting on the front lines for, that's great. But when you start to word salad it with social justice terms, there are activists on all sides of the spectrum who can use the same blueprint and model. And hearkening back to our first article, right? This one only assumes that you're going to have activists on the left that are kind of taking advantage of these tools to, become an activist and earn great rewards. It's a little bit tone deaf to me. And it really doesn't look at how the same model can and will be used by the right, and perhaps by better funded organizations, because often the right tends to be people who have more money to fund these kinds of organizations. So I think you're right that, activism for me needs to be born out of a cause and something you truly believe in. And it might not come with a salary, and it might just come with a passion. And then, if a nonprofit starts up around that organically, great. But I don't think you want to be like well, little Jane, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be an activist. It doesn't quite ring for me. So anyway, we can leave it there. So AJ, I think that'll do it for this article. Why don't you bring us our question of the week?
Yeah. So we have a question coming in this week regarding somebody that's essentially job hunting in the nonprofit sector, and they're doing their due diligence here. And their question is, admin expenses don't match up with offered salaries. Is that a red flag? So the person says that they're looking for a new job, found one that looks awesome, did some digging on the website and kind of looked at their annual report in 990. And what they're saying is it's essentially their advertised salary that they're reporting for this job is about $10,000 less than what they're reporting as administrative costs in their most recent annual report. And there's about 20 employees, they say, on the website. And they're asking, is this a red flag? If not, what categories do expenses typically fall under? And they're essentially saying that what they're saying is, let's say that the administrative cost or the administrative bucket of expenses that they're seeing on the annual report says like $40,000, but the advertised position, say it's like a development position, is offering $50,000 for a salary, and they're wondering how that can be if that their entire salary is what they're reporting as administrative salaries in either the 990 on their financial statements or in this annual report. And so I thought it was an interesting question because I think it really shows the divide in how the general public that doesn't know nonprofit accounting or kind of looks at this, and kind of there's a misunderstanding, I think, behind what administrative cost really is and how somebody's salary is allocated if you're an administrative portion of the organization. But Mark, I rambled long enough. Why don't you take first shot at this and see if we can't help this person out or help our viewers out understand admin expenses in a nonprofit?
Yeah, I think you're right on that absolutely this admin cost could be spread out over different departments, could be allocated different ways. And lots of costs can, right? A CFO's salary can be spread around, your executive director could be spread around, because often in a nonprofit, when you're looking, especially at grant-funded activity, you're looking at percentages as to how much a person is doing as to where we allocate it. Oftentimes, as we've discussed ad nauseum on this podcast, there are restricted monies that need to only, that are scheduled to have a certain amount of labor that goes to them. And so you want to actually track even your salary people. You want to track percentages of time or hours that they're spending on certain projects so that you can then funnel those costs into specific projects. So it would not surprise me at all if there's an admin position that might do some marketing on the side or might, help with some fundraising costs. And these could all be parsed out where an admin cost on the bottom line, statement of activities doesn't look as high or doesn't encompass somebody's total salary, but that salary could be spread out upon different departments. I would say, if this has red flags for you, then you probably need to either ask some questions or, try to have somebody with more knowledge of the financials parse it out for you a little bit more, see if there are restricted projects where maybe some of the costs are going, and see what else would go into those admin costs. Because often admin costs are way more than just salaries. That might be a large chunk of it, but there could be supplies, et cetera, utilities. It just depends. Every organization's a little bit different. So that's my initial take. AJ, you got some more to add to that?
Yeah, I think I think the main thing that the author of this question is missing is how nonprofits allocate their expenses across their different programs and their administrative and fundraising costs. And let's take the executive director, for instance, of a nonprofit that works in children's healthcare or something like that. If and they used to be they are a medical doctor, but they moved over to philanthropy, and they're working as the executive director of this nonprofit. It's very likely that this person, as the executive director, doesn't just do executive director things during the day. They might do a bit of fundraising. They might do a bit of administrative work, reviewing budgets or something like that. They might do, lead team meetings and, give an address to the entire, more of what we think is like administrative duties. Then, on the other hand, they might actually work in programs. And so part of their time would be dedicated to fundraising. Part of their time would be dedicated in and allocated to administrative, of course. And then if they're working on a specific project, very much you allocate their dollars to that specific program, and it wouldn't show up as an administrative cost. Same thing goes with rent. If you have a 1,000 square foot of office space and all of your program staff, takes up 90% of your office space, then that percentage of rent would go to, if you're allocating it based on square footage, $900 of the $1,000 rent would go to, to programs. The other 10% is taken up by administrative, and that would go to the admin costs. So just looking at the administrative cost of the organization, especially on like one of these yearly annual reports that, it kind of fuses, a narrative and marketing kind of spin on the organization and a financial kind of redacted or very slimmed down version, what we call like a slim kind of financial statement of very broad categories. I think you would, if you're really that interested in how like the how they're allocating, you can take a look at their 990 and their executive compensation and see how that's spread over program fundraising and expenses and the functional expense portion of the 990. And I would say, to this person that it's not necessarily a red flag if, your salary or your expected salary is $50,000 and, admin budget for salary and expenses is $40,000. It just means that it's giving you a primer that you may not just be doing, say you're a fundraiser, you may not just be working in fundraising. You might have some programmatic responsibilities that you take on, or some, other duties that would fall under a program that, would be allocated, or it leans to the fact that they're using an allocation method that's been approved that spreads everybody's salaries based on hours worked of the overall organization, and they're allocating salary, or they're allocating payroll, wholesale as a unit based on actual hours worked by people in that distribution. So I would just say that, just because admin says one, the admin expense on this annual report says one thing, and your salary is more than what that administrative budget is, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a red flag or the organization is going under or something. I would look at their cash balance to know the organization is going under, more so than I would look at, their expense line and matching that up to the salary.
Yeah. And I think just to put a bow on this, I would be less concerned about reading the budget and more concerned about advocating for yourself, right? If you want that $50,000 salary, then go into your interview with that number in mind and know what's reasonable for an organization of that size, et cetera. Look on Glassdoor or some of these other places where you can find comparable salary ranges, and, fight for yourself. And if this organization is only willing to pay $30,000 for a $50,000 job, then, look elsewhere. So I would say, you're probably, especially if you're going to become an admin, the likelihood of you getting involved in the nuts and bolts and nitty gritty of the financials is probably not so high. So you may never actually get an answer to this question unless you make friends with some of your accountants. We're a lot of friendly people, so feel free to do that. But I don't know that getting into the weeds and talking yourself out of a job because the financials look unexpected. Just don't do that. Go for an interview and just see. Ask questions. So I think with that, we've come to the end of our podcasting day. So thank you so much for joining us again for another episode of Profitless on Purpose. Easy for me to say. We really appreciate you being here and listening along with us. As always, we welcome your comments on the YouTube or on Twitter at ProfitlessPod. Stay connected with us. We always want more of your questions. We might even have an all questions episode coming up soon. So there's still time. Get them in. So anyway, we appreciate you being here. And on behalf of AJ and myself, thanks so much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.